I'm going to move along to John Plastow, who's on my far left here. So, John, you're next.
Thanks, Wendy. I'm going to give the view from Care International to look at what the report and the conclusions mean in terms of care's practice, hopefully to be a little bit self-critical about what we do, as well as to kind of give some pointers about perhaps what we're aiming to do in the light of those recommendations. And I want to make four broad themes here. First of all, an observation about the general applicability of this work. Secondly, to touch on some issues around implications for our humanitarian principles. Thirdly, look at the linkages with some recent care practice and to what extent we were truly conflict sensitive or otherwise. And finally, look ahead to what we're planning to do in terms of institutionalization of conflict sensitive practice. So the first thing to say is, genuinely, I would urge anybody who hasn't read this to read it. It's a short and very accessible document, and in my view, one of, even though care is involved, one of the more accessible resources for practitioners. I think it's a very pragmatic document which has its heart kind of realism and understanding of the situation of hard-pressed humanitarians on the ground, and is a guide for what can really be done in those contexts where there's so many pressures being faced. I think it builds on existing practice. It's not a paradigm shift, and as was said in the presentation, it's really kind of looking to add to what's already good humanitarian practice, I think. Another thing that's important for me, and particularly our work in care, is that it brings together, I think, two spheres of work that perhaps don't have enough dialogue, which are the spheres of working in a non-conflict and humanitarian response. And for example, when I read the HER report, although the terms of reference were slightly limited, I feel it's disappointing that there isn't enough discussion of where those two worlds overlap, and they very clearly do. So I think it's a very useful contribution, at a time when we are looking more seriously, particularly in the UK, but more broadly around what makes for good humanitarian practice. And I think it's a report that talks both to those contexts of more profound societal conflict, the Somalias, the Darfurs of this world, where there are very huge risk implications for both affected populations, but also us as humanitarian actors, as well as those more kind of social, community-led level type of conflicts, such as we're seeing in urban contexts such as Haiti, or rural areas, the Sahel or the Horn, where there of course is humanitarian interaction, but we're not looking at such kind of, it's a lower level of conflict exacerbated by natural disaster. And finally, I do think it's an important contribution to the general push within agencies around context analysis, something that's very important to care, whether in or outside of conflict. Moving on to the issue of humanitarian principles, I feel that there is a little bit of a move to risk aversion these days in quite a lot of our practice, a tendency towards low visibility remote monitoring, and at times even complete withdrawal of agencies. Of course, the motivation behind this is laudable, and we have to really take extraordinarily seriously issues around staff safety and security. But at times it may come at the expense of providing aid where it's most truly needed, and I think this is an issue that is very much in focus at the moment, and makes us think seriously about our obligations under the humanitarian imperative. I was recently at the ECHO Partners Conference, and I was struck by the words, as I think a number of other participants were, of John Ging, who's a senior OCHA representative in their operations, who came up with the phrase of the need to risk lives to save lives. And it struck a chord, I think, and I think he wasn't talking about cavalier madcap intervention of kind of cowboy humanitarianism, but I think he was talking about the need for us, that is the sphere that we're in. We accept certain levels of risks in order to reach vulnerable, conflict-affected communities. And I think that conflict sensitivity is a framework or an approach which will enable us to make those calculations about what are appropriate levels of risk, and maybe kind of push back on some tendencies towards risk aversion and help us more effectively manage risk. I just want to draw on one example of work that we've done in the Somali context around promoting risk management. I think we spent some time working with our staff, the majority of whom are local, of course, looking at developing methodologies that will help them create a safe space for talking around conflict issues. We use a kind of storytelling methodology. And I think this is an approach to kind of name that it's acceptable to talk about the challenges that we face. And of course, staff sometimes in this risk-averse environment see by raising these issues, they might be talking themselves out of a job even. So we're trying to create, acknowledgement of this space and methodologies to facilitate that. Looking at what CARE does across different sectors, I think in line with the thinking or the analysis from the paper, I think the best general practice, I mean there are exceptions, but it's this idea of implicit conflict sensitivity. I think there are plenty of examples from our work where we are doing work that takes account of conflict dynamics, but I think the issue and one of the key points of the paper is we need to be more explicit about our approach. And too often, of course, a lot of our practice is conflict sensitive blind. But I'd just like to draw on a couple of examples of perhaps where we've done rather better of late. One is from Haiti, where we were heavily involved in work on shelter, and where we set up an interagency forum to look at issues of power and control in that sector. Working through the Shelter Cluster Working Group, we set up a group looking at housing, land and property, involving representatives from a number of clusters. And what that did was to bring in not just the usual suspects, but to bring in lawyers, Haitian lawyers, and experts on land in that context. And this helped us give a more nuanced approach to our interventions. This is in a context where land is heavily controlled by a group of very powerful, a very limited number of stakeholders who in some contexts could even be considered or described as kind of warlords in that context. So, there's this mantra of building back better, but without a kind of sensitive approach to the dynamics of land and ownership. This was only likely to fuel local level tensions, including with some of these very powerful landowners. So there's one example of, we didn't necessarily call it conflict sensitive approach, but it certainly took into account that dynamic. Recently I was up in northern Kenya looking at work we've been doing in the fragile context on the Kenyan-Ethiopian border. And there we've been investing in work to promote effective cross-border work on the Ethiopian-Kenyan border. These are contexts which have seen a lot of conflict in the past, which have much larger ramifications for drought cycle management. But we've been quite successful in promoting approaches around natural resource management, around water and pasture. And I think in contexts like that, and it links to the discussion on Sri Lanka, where we're much more aware of these dynamics, when inevitably you get into that humanitarian response cycle, I think our ability to provide appropriate forms of humanitarian assistance, be it in water, through trucking or cash to help communities manage those resources, the chances of us to be more effective and not exacerbate conflict are much greater. There are examples we could draw on, but I think there's a very nice table in the back of the document, Table 1, which looks at best practice for conflict-sensitive humanitarian response, and it looks at frameworks such as accountability, gender and participation. And I think building on those good examples of humanitarian practice, we can just overlay this conflict-sensitive lens and achieve a great deal. And I think that's at the core of the thinking of the document. Finally moving on to what CARE is trying to do to institutionalize conflict sensitivity. CARE has a central care emergencies group which operates out of Geneva and coordinates all of our emergency response work, and we're integrating into the CI CARE International Emergency Toolkit a chapter on conflict sensitivity. So this is a very kind of user-friendly guide which many practitioners use, and so we're really putting it at the forefront of that piece of work. We're also investing in developing a conflict sensitivity training curriculum at 3 levels, a training for frontline workers, but also for managers, those who are responsible for the overall effectiveness of country operations, and then those working at a global level. And finally, we're integrating awareness and training into the work of those who are on the roster for emergency development. So those who are parachuted into different contexts come with a conflict sensitive lens. In the wake of this work, which is linked to the work that we do on the Conflict Sensitivity Consortium, we are being more deliberate, and in contexts like Dadaab, which has been very much in the news, we're already taking moves to look at risk mitigation strategies in that context. We're working with colleagues in Somalia to build on work around accountability and promote different mechanisms for participation, community-based monitoring, which hopefully can bring about more conflict-sensitive outcomes. And just to wrap up, I think this work for us is part of a broad organisational commitment towards greater contextual analysis. Conflict sensitivity analysis allows us to do this in fragile contexts, but I think a key lesson for us is that it shouldn't happen just at the moment of intervention. So we're investing in emergency preparedness planning, as I said, pre-deployment trainings, and building the sets of technical teams so that when it comes to an intervention, they're better equipped to act appropriately. And in so doing, I think that the title of the Conflict Sensitivity Consortium is From Concept to Impact. And I think by focusing on what I think is a bit of a missing piece of the jigsaw around our ability to do effective analysis, looking at the kind of ability of frontline workers in humanitarian contexts, we're helping build that cycle of analysis. And I think in so doing, we're better equipped both, as I said, in those contexts of more extreme forms of conflict and those more modest forms of kind of social level context to be more relevant humanitarians.
John, thank you.